So here's a thought. What if a single conflict, a war known by like four different names, didn't just reshape global powers back then, but its echoes are still really loud in our world today? Welcome to the deep dive. This is where we take the sources you send us, could be articles, research papers, maybe even your own notes, and we pull out the most important bits, the surprising facts. Our mission is basically to give you a shortcut, a way to get properly informed without drowning in information. And today, we're diving into the conflict most people just call the Vietnam War. But as the material you shared makes clear right away, that's only one name for it.
Exactly. It's also widely known as the Second Indochina War.
Right.
And maybe most importantly, in Vietnam itself, it's often called the American War, or sometimes the War to Resist America.
Yeah, that perspective is crucial. This was a hugely impactful Cold War proxy conflict.
And you've given us some really solid, comprehensive material to work with for this deep dive. We'll be looking at its official start and end dates, that long stretch from November 1st, 1955, right through to the fall of Saigon, April 30th, 1975.
Wow, nearly 20 years.
Yeah, it's incredible. And what's also really clear from these sources is just how wide the war spread geographically. It wasn't just Vietnam.
No.
No, it heavily involved Laos and Cambodia, too. The whole region, really.
Okay, so let's try and unpack this a bit. We're going to dig into the sheer scale of it all, the kind of alliances that formed, some quite unexpected, actually, and the human cost, which is just staggering. And here's where it gets really interesting, I think. We'll also see how the way it ended didn't just, stop the fighting there. It actually seemed to directly spark several other wars and created these huge lasting changes in societies all over the globe. Don't worry, we'll guide you through it all, focus on what really matters from these sources. So maybe to start with that scale, when we talk about a conflict going on for almost 2 decades, what kind of picture do the sources paint? Just the duration itself, the resources involved.
That's a really good starting point. It spanned 19 years, 5 months. It's more than just a number, isn't it? It shows this incredible, deep commitment from everyone involved. And the massive drain on people and money. I mean, just imagine a conflict grinding on for that long. It fundamentally changes societies.
Absolutely.
And like we mentioned, it wasn't just contained in Vietnam. The fighting spilled over quite intensely, actually, into Laos and Cambodia. It really shows how much of Indochina just became this theater of war.
Right, right. So it was genuinely a regional war, not just contained.
Definitely.
And talking about scale, the documents you send highlight these huge armies involved. What do we learn about the actual forces clashing?
Yeah, the numbers are quite something. You had the People's Army of Vietnam, the PAVN, and the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, the ARVN, down south.
Yeah.
Both fielded massive forces. Just for perspective, the ARVN, South Vietnam's army, was actually the 4th largest army in the world around 1970.
4th largest, wow.
Yeah, about 1 million regular soldiers. And the PAVN, along with the Viet Cong, that was the National Liberation Front military arm operating in the South, they're, roughly similar in size combined.
So this wasn't some small jungle skirmish.
Oh, not at all. This was a clash of enormous, sustained military power with major world powers backing each side.
Okay, well, that leads us perfectly into those alliances you mentioned, maybe some unlikely ones. You had the U.S. and the ARVM on one side, obviously. But who is backing North Vietnam and the Viet Cong? And how did that fit into the whole Cold War picture?
Right, and this is where it gets really complex and, frankly, fascinating. North of Vietnam and the Viet Cong, and later their political wing, the PRG.
The Provisional Revolutionary Government?
Exactly. They got huge amounts of support from both the Soviet Union and China.
Okay, both.
Both. And what's really interesting here is how that simmering tension, the Sino-Soviet split, the ideological rivalry between Communist China and the USSR.
Yeah, I remember that.
That directly affected how they supported Hanoi. Sometimes they were almost competing for influence, which could mean even more aid for North Vietnam.
So they could play them off each other?
To an extent, yes.
Yeah.
But it also created complexities for Hanoi and their allies on the ground. It wasn't simple.
So it complicates that simple East versus West proxy narrative, doesn't it? There were layers even within the communist bloc support.
Precisely. It wasn't monolithic at all.
How did that play out strategically for the North Vietnamese and for the U.S.?
Well, for Hanoi, like you said, it sometimes meant they could leverage that rivalry to get more resources, different kinds of support. For the U.S. and its allies, it meant they were facing this really formidable, well-equipped enemy,
Right.
an enemy that was adept at both conventional warfare and highly effective guerrilla tactics.
Huh.
The sources really emphasize that understanding these kind of behind-the-scenes alliance dynamics is key to understanding why the war lasted so long and was
Yeah.
so intense.
Makes sense. And, well, inevitably with a conflict of this sheer scale and length, the human cost, the numbers and the sources are. They're just incredibly hard to wrap your head around. What do they tell us?
Yeah, the human toll it's truly devastating. Just looking at Vietnamese casualties, the estimates range from about 966,000
Okay.
up to possibly 3.8 million. That includes soldiers and civilians on both sides.
3.8 million, that range itself is huge.
It is. And that massive range tells its own story, doesn't it?
Yeah.
About the chaos, the brutality, and just the sheer difficulty of getting accurate numbers in that kind of prolonged, widespread conflict.
Yeah.
And beyond Vietnam, you have hundreds of thousands of Cambodians and Laotians who also lost their lives as the war completely destabilized their countries, too.
Right. The spillover wasn't just political, it was deadly.
Absolutely. And then for the United States, the figure is 58,220 military personnel killed, plus another 1,626 still listed as missing in action.
Staggering numbers. These aren't abstract figures, these are lives.
Exactly. Immense, unimaginable suffering and loss spread across so many nations. So if we try to, connect all these threads to the bigger picture, this deep dive has really shown just how incredibly complex and far-reaching the Vietnam War truly was.
Yeah, definitely.
We've touched on its immense length, almost 2 decades. The massive armies involved, like the ARVN being one of the world's largest at the time.
That still amazes me.
Right. And we've also had to confront that devastating human cost. Those estimates for Vietnamese casualties possibly reaching into the millions, plus the hundreds of thousands in Cambodia and Laos, and over 58,000 American military deaths. And the primary outcome, as the sources state clearly, was a victory for North Vietnam and the Viet Cong PRG alliance.
Which led to the U.S. withdrawal?
Exactly. U.S. troop withdrawal and ultimately the establishment of communist governments, not just in a unified Vietnam, Socialist Republic of Vietnam, but also in Cambodia and Laos. But what's really quite insightful from the materials is how the formal end of the war wasn't really an end at all. It was almost like a trigger, a catalyst for whole new crises.
How so?
Well, the sources point out that the Sino-Soviet split, that tension between China and the USSR, which had sort of quieted down while they both backed Hanoi, it flared right back up almost immediately afterwards. And the conflict directly sparked new wars.
New wars. Like what?
Like the Cambodia-Vietnam War.
Yeah.
That kicked off really quickly, largely due to these brutal border raids by the Khmer Rouge regime in Cambodia.
The ones responsible for the genocide there.
The very same. Their actions provoked a Vietnamese invasion. And then, even more directly, China actually invaded Vietnam in 1979.
China invaded Vietnam after they'd been allies.
Yes, the Sino-Vietnamese War. And border clashes between them continued, believe it or not, all the way up until 1991.
Wow. Okay, so the end was just the start of more conflict in the region.
In many ways, yes. And this period also marks the beginning of that huge humanitarian crisis, the Vietnamese boat people, the wider Indochina refugee crisis. Millions fled the new regimes.
And so many died trying to escape.
Tragically, yes. Estimates suggest around 250,000 might have died at sea.
So, pulling back again, what does all this mean for us now, for the world today? This deep dive, it's shown not just the war's results, but these incredible ripple effects. The material you sent talks about the Vietnam syndrome in the U.S. What was that exactly?
Yeah, the Vietnam syndrome. It refers to this real deep-seated public reluctance in America after Vietnam to get involved in foreign military interventions.
An aversion to overseas wars.
Exactly. And that, combined with the Watergate scandal happening around the same time, really fueled this major crisis of confidence in American institutions and leadership during the 1970s.
Right, I see.
It's a really powerful example, isn't it, how historical events, even long after the fighting stops officially, just keep shaping a nation's psychology, its foreign policy decisions, global dynamics, for decades, really.
Yeah, it absolutely does. The echoes are still there. Which kind of leads to a final question, maybe some for you, the listener, to think about. How do the unaddressed consequences of past conflicts, whether they're societal shifts or geopolitical tensions left simmering, how do they continue to influence our present and maybe even our future long after the last shots are fired?